Welcome, y'all. Wes with DIY Food Plot Pro. Thanks so much for joining us. The number one question that I get asked is, what should I plant on my farm? Today, we are going to discuss exactly how I determine what food plots go on which farms that I have. My name is Wes. I run the channel DIY Food Plot Pro. I have a Bachelor's of Science in Agronomy degree, which is plant and soil science. I farm for a living, and I have 1,800 acre whitetail deer hunting outfitter in Western Kentucky where we cannot bait. So we rely heavily on food plots, and I bring you guys along sharing with you how I do these food plots and all the little details involved. I rent a lot of new farms from the outfit, and when I'm trying to decide what food plots to plant on those farms, there's a whole lot of thought process goes in to exactly which food plot would do best and be the most successful on that farm. I don't plant just one food plot. I don't have just a specific one that this is the one that I plant the most. I plant a wide variety of food plots. I plant everything from corn, standing soybeans, lab, clover, alfalfa, brassicas, all the cereal grains. I have tried them on the 1,800 acres, and I still experiment with them very regular. So the first thing that I look at when I'm trying to determine what food plot to plant on a new farm is the limiting factors. There's always limiting factors that go into every single food plot location that I have. The first limiting factor that I deal with most, that I think is going to resonate with a lot of you guys, is the size of the plot. If we have a small plot in the middle of 300 or 400 acres of woods and we got a quarter acre out in the middle of it, we can start crossing a lot of food plots off that list quickly. That goes hand in hand with sunlight, the size of the plot, because if you have a small, teeny little plot in the middle of the woods, it's going to get very little sunlight, and there's very few plots that are going to thrive in those conditions. So you can start eliminating really quickly several of them. Another limiting factor that many folks don't realize is the width of the plot. So most of us are setting up whitetail food plots for hunting. We set them up on the edges of woods somewhere. Those are usually the best type of areas that we have for food plots. Well, we've all seen those narrow stretches that usually typically run along a creek bottom where you got hardwoods on each side, or pines, whatever's in your environment. And a lot of people don't realize what kind of a trap you're setting for yourself when you're setting one of those plots up. The reality of it is, if you have a narrow strip, and I have a lot of these myself that might not be 30, 40 yards wide, and you got mature hardwoods on each side, and you do have enough sunlight in that particular spot. But the issue is you have tree sap. And what tree sap is those mature trees put down roots that go underneath that field. So even on years where you're getting plentiful rain, you're still dealing with drought conditions because those huge roots of those big hardwoods are robbing you of moisture the entire year. Now, because that is a very negative thing for spring and summer growth, we wouldn't want to put a annual crop in there. We would want to switch more to a fall food source, because in the fall the saps goes down in the trees and they're not actively sucking that moisture as much, and there's typically a lot more moisture around in the fall and winter time. Those plots can really do well when set up for a fall food source, and they can really do awful set up for a spring or summer food source. The soil is a huge limiting factor. Every farm I get, the very first thing I do is I go to the soil survey and I'm pulling up maps and I'm IDing good soil from bad soil. That's the first thing you have to do when you're putting a food plot. Now, a lot of us deal with bad soil. A lot of you up north deal with sand. A lot of us in the south deal with rocks and clay. Those soils can be improved. And I would encourage you, before you started trying to raise one of those higher energy, higher need crops, I would recommend spending a couple years or at least a year in building that soil up to where it can sustain those. If you've got pure sand and you can't hold any moisture, you don't have any organic matter, planting corn is not going to be the great thing for you. That's going to end in disaster because there's no organic matter to hold any water in that soil. There's no water holding capacity in that soil. You can change that, but it takes time to do that. That's not something that you can change just like that. And dealing with our soils is a very much a limiting factor on many of these farms. High density deer zones are very much a limiting factor as well. Around here where I'm at, there are very high populations of whitetails. Even in a pretty good sized plot, they can get wiped out really, really quickly by a high density deer herd. I have to be very careful of what plots I'm putting where that are not going to be so attracted to the whitetails in the summer months that they're going to completely wipe them out, or I have to protect that plot. And I've done that many different ways. I've got a lot of videos explaining how I do that, but scarecrows are my best way that I have found this year that really protect food plots really, really well. So the next thing that I'm looking at when I am looking at what food sources to plant is I'm looking at what natural food sources are going to be available that time of the year. Is the farm that you're setting up like me have a lot of white oaks here? In those years that acorns are plentiful, your food plot is going to see minimal usage. I have said this many times on the channel, there is absolutely nothing that you can plant that is going to pull whitetails and hold them like white oak acorns. They are the most preferred food source in the whitetail woods, period, explanation point. Looking at your farm, you got to figure out what are those natural food sources that are going to be available. Do you have grain farms surrounding your hunting property? Those farms are going to be harvested, and when those farms get harvested, the deer are going to flock to them. When the acorns drop, the deer are going to flock to them. Same thing with persimmons. So you have to look at your natural food sources and see what's in that area, what's available to your whitetails. So one thing that I look at particularly, if I am surrounded by grain fields, as a lot of my fields are the fields getting tilled after harvest? Typically. I know every year might be a little different, but typically, is the guy who tends the farms around you, is he into tillage or is he straight no-till? That makes a huge, huge difference when you're deciding what to plant. Here's why. If it's a no-till cornfield or soybean field and he combines that field late, as typically farmers do, the size of the farmers are getting bigger, it takes them longer to get around. He comes in there late October and the weather's already started cooling and shells that corn or cuts those soybeans. Combines do a great job of getting most of the grain, but they don't get all of it by any stretch of the imagination. When they're going through, they're spitting grain out the back. That's part of the loss that farmers have, is they lose grain out the back of the machine. Now, if the ground temperature is already cold, the outside temperature is already cold, that seed, that corn or soybean seed, needs heat to germinate. So if it's sitting on top of the ground and it's already like it is today in the 30s, it's not gonna germ up. It's just gonna sit there. It's gonna stay viable all winter long until it's either ate or it germs back up or it rots. If you have a guy who's no-tilling and he goes through and he harvests all that field and then leaves it, you have got piles and piles of food left out there for a lot of the winter. On the flip side of that, if you have a guy who likes to till and you've got a small property in the middle of all surrounding ag property, and he combines his corn and then he runs a ripper through it, runs a chisel and a disc through it to get it ready for next year, as in the case they do a lot of that up north, that is going to incorporate a lot of that seed into that warming ground. You got to realize that the outside temperature might be cool, but the soil temperature at that point is typically still warm enough for germ. So it's going to germ a lot of that corn, a lot of that soybeans back up, and then a frost is going to kill it. So your food source is going to look a lot different from a conventional tillage farm to a no-till farm. So if you have a no-till farm, it's likely not the best idea to have a big standing corn food plot if you have 400 acres of no-till corn that's been harvested around you. But on the flip side of that, if you have a farmer who tills everything, a 2-acre standing cornfield in December might be absolutely the ticket to punching that big buck tag. The third thing I look at when I'm setting up food plots is, when am I wanting to hunt those whitetails? If that's early season, whether that's mid-season, whether that's late season, I typically believe that the early and the late season is the best time to utilize your food plots for harvesting specific animals. That's not to say that the mid-season can't be good. Absolutely has produced a lot of good deer for us. The mid-season for us is usually in November. That's what I'm calling the middle part of the season. The early part of the season is anywhere from September into that late October range, and the late season is December and after. The early season and the late season are really good for targeting specific animals. The mid-season is when our rut is happening, and food is not a huge priority during that time period, and there are tons and tons of different food sources that whitetails are utilizing during that period. In the early season, alfalfa, soybeans and lab, clover, and brassicas. Brassicas are a really good food plot early season. A lot of folks haven't had a lot of luck with brassicas of the deer actually eating them. I would highly suggest trying those food plots again, making sure the fertility is there, because if the fertility is not there, I have noticed and I have seen deer will not eat the brassicas nearly as good when the fertility in the soil is not there. You keep that fertility high, the P and the K, and give it all the nitrogen that it wants, and I think you're going to see a noticeable difference in the amount of deer eating those brassicas. Brassicas have always been something that I think a lot of us look at for a late season hunting, and I have seen this through the years a lot, that the whitetails will hit those brassicas early in the fall. Late summer, early fall, there's always a period where green sources really run down. And if you can have a green source during that time, you can expect some really, really good hunting over those green plots. The mid-season is something that you're going to find whitetails feeding all over. And that's one reason that I'm not as key on hunting food plots in the middle part of the season, because there are so many different plots that you find whitetails in. It can literally be any food plot that you plant, or it can be the acorns, the persimmons. There is so much food around at that time of the year, it's really, really difficult to compete to pull deer to a certain area. During the late season, I definitely have found that standing corn is my favorite. I know a lot of folks up north like standing soybeans. I've never had a ton of luck with standing soybeans. My deer just don't eat them very good. We don't get a lot of snow, and that's not a preferred food source for my area. Standing corn, cereal grains, which is oats, cereal rye, and winter wheat, and brassicas. All of those are really good late season. And what I like about the late season is those deer are run down from the rut. They are trying to rebuild from that rut. So food all of a sudden comes back to priority at that point. When I'm setting these plots up, I'm looking at planting several different species of plants out there. I think diversity is key in your food plots attracting a large number of whitetails over a longer period of time. If we all had it our way, we would have a 3-4 acre food plot, and we would have multiple different things: standing corn, brassicas, cereal grains, maybe a small plot of clover in and amongst there, and really be able to pull those whitetails for a longer period of time. I love standing corn. I've made that pretty known on the channel. It's probably one of my favorite plots to hunt, but I don't just plant standing corn on a single farm. Not one single plot of mine do I just have standing corn. On all of them, I have standing corn, brassicas, cereal rye. Some of them I have some crimson clover in. I mix that up to try to attract the most amount of whitetails over a longer period of time. And I think that's absolutely key in hunting this. And I think trial and error is a huge thing. I can tell you what works on my farms. I can give you some general recommendations to go off of that will help you in your hunting. But what I can't tell you is how your deer are going to react to your food plots. That is completely different than what my deer are going to react. There's guys that are on this channel that are from Kentucky, same place as me, and they're seeing different things than what I'm seeing. So trial and error is huge in this whole grand scheme of things of hunting and hunting food plots, figuring out what your whitetails want and fill that need, fill that void for them, and have better hunts. So thank you guys for watching. I really appreciate it. Smash that like and subscribe button if you hadn't already.